Okay, thank you, Ricky. Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Look at all this sunshine beaming from all the eyes of people that know what the world's really all about. They get tuned in to land and creatures and all forms of life that is really so sacred. I got this strange invitation to come this morning and introduce this person that I've met, I don't know, maybe a decade ago or so. And it's the strangest thing. Have you ever been felt like you're being washed away in a flood and all these people around you and everybody's like, just the current is carrying them down the river. And here comes this guy swimming against the current and he goes right by. That's this person, Christopher Brown. He's like, he has a way of seeing things that many people don't. He found this piece of land that is what they call a brown field. Has anybody ever heard of that word? Yeah, I think that's one of the most famous traits that a white man has, is being able to make brown fields, you know? So he found one and decided to put his home on top of it. And apparently there's a gas pipeline that goes through the middle of it, and it broke and messed up the land or something. I really haven't, I've heard about it. I've seen some pictures. I've seen Chris and his wife who designed it, and they put it, the house is split where this pipeline goes right down the middle, and they kind of have glass that looks down, and but otherwise the house is kind of underground, and it's ultra modern and simple and efficient, and it's been covered with a blackland prairie over its roof. So that's how we really met. Is he needed to get the genetics and a little bit of advice. How do you build a prairie? So, you know, different things happened over these years. He gave me this book that he wrote. I mean, he doesn't know that I only went to the 11th grade, and I'm really a very slow reader. I'm the kind of person that doesn't like to go to the next paragraph unless I really get the one I just read. So sometimes I have to read stuff a couple of times to get it. And then I also don't like to read a lot of books. I just like to read one that's good, and I might read it again, you know, because it's so good. But I think this one he wrote is called Tropic of Kansas. And I think it's about this uprising of the folks out in the rural areas. They were so disappointed the way that their government politicians were not representing them. And somehow they elected a whole bunch of businessmen, like billionaires, to run the country. And he wrote this thing in like 10 years ago. And he gave me a copy. It's right by my bed. I saw it this morning. It's been there. How long ago was it when you gave me that? Yeah, so I mean, when I get old, I'm going to read these things. So otherwise, I'm too busy trying to. I don't know. He's an exceptionally creative writer. He's written numerous books, and I think he is swimming against the current and doing nicely at it. He takes these nice strides and strokes. He's not out of breath, or, you know, it's like he was born to do this. And I'd like to introduce Chris Brown.
It's nice to get an introduction like that from your favorite shaman. I have to say, one of my favorite things to read these days are the letters that Bill writes in the beginning of every Native American seed catalog. I mean, really, they're hard to match for eloquence and feeling. And And if you don't get that catalog, you really need to. We're getting set up here. And maybe I'll start talking while he gets this going here. So yeah, so as Bill indicated, I'm Chris Brown. I live here in Austin. I am not a scientist. I'm gonna scoot around here, maybe it'd be easier to give you room. I'm an author, and I came late in my career as an author to nature writing. I'm also a lawyer, not an environmental lawyer, but a business lawyer who's kind of paid most of his bills in life working in the heart of, techno-capitalism here in Austin, working with startups and, and more mature technology companies. I wanted to, and I started, well, I'm going to wait till he gets this going here, but the book, A Natural History of Empty Lots, that I'm here to talk about today, is a mix of nature writing, narrative nonfiction, and memoir, kind of telling the story, a very personal story that Bill related about finding ways to reconnect with the natural world through the prism of the most blighted industrial and urban spaces. Taking an approach to nature writing, which is a genre I've always loved. It's I come from, my mother's an immigrant from Germany who came over after the war. She lived as a refugee as a child for 2 years after World War II with her mother, roaming around and living off the land. And so I grew up with this kind of mom who was a forager, who had that kind of way of approaching the garden, and that sort of love of landscape romance, of just a natural, intense connection with the wonder that you can find in both the grandest and the most almost microscopic kind of manifestations of the natural world around us. But maybe because I'm also, and that interest in reigniting the sense of wonder is what drew me to writing speculative fiction and works of the fantastic. But I'm also a realist. I work in the business world, right? As a lawyer, I see the things people do every day around money. Okay, and we got this up finally. And that gives you a little bit of a little bit of cynicism in terms of how you look at the natural world. And so this book is essentially so this is a book of nature writing that mixes nature writing, but also narrative nonfiction, meaning kind of, book like sharing ideas and trying to do so in a way that ties into observations of nature, and also of, economics and law and things that I have a little more qualification to speak about, and memoir, the personal story of kind of being a young dad and, caught up in the rat race and figuring out fresh ways to reconnect with the natural world. And this is the beautiful cover designed by the folks at Timber Press, an imprint of Hachette that's actually based out in Portland. And that's a photo of the green roof on our house that Bill remarked about. And I'll give a little slightly reality check version of that story in a minute. And the observant members of this crowd will note what I noted to the designer, that she got the colors of the flowers wrong when she hand tinted them from the black and white photo I had given her for the interior. All these photos in this presentation are by me. Many of them appear in the book, and they're designed to kind of give you a sense of the material. So this is kind of my favorite native plant of Texas, my personal favorite as a lover of empty lots, the chiltepin, aka Chile pequin. I guess some would argue there's two different plants by those two different names. Chiltepin, of course, is like an Aztec name, a Nahuatl name that meant flea pepper, a name that's been, I think, Hispanicized to Chile pequin and other variants, right? This is a plant that sort of, I came to learn, only grows in basically empty lots, right? This is like the kind of ur plant of long gone wild. And in my experience with this plant was sort of a good example of the experience of the approach I've tried to take to kind of learning about native plants, even though I had a mom who was constantly trying to teach me and other friends and access to this great institution we're lucky to be in today. But I have this kind of contrarian idea that I riff on in the book and in the weekly or now bi-weekly newsletter I do of urban nature writing called Field Notes, where I kind of developed this material over the last 5 years, starting right before lockdown, which was well timed. And I joke that taxonomy is the enemy of wonder. That we have a habit in this culture, as my friend Jennifer could testify to, hanging out with birders. You're probably all birders. I better be very careful of showing off our ability to name the thing rather than first having the kind of unmediated experience of it, the object in nature, which is a way of just objectifying nature in the first place and making it separate and apart from us, right? They're very like, oh, I have to name the thing. I have to know the information from the book before I go out and experience the thing. My book is more about like, I don't know what the heck I'm doing. I'm gonna take my kid though. It's Saturday. He's like, what are we gonna do, Dad? And I don't want to go to the mall or get in the car. I'm like, well, let's, instead of going out the driveway to the car, let's go through the backyard and find our way into that creek back here and see what we find. And lo and behold, there's a lot more interesting things there. And I'll circle back to this to the Chili Pekin maybe, and to the idea of these sorts of plants like this that reveal when you learn about them slowly, first by like, what's this? And then somebody says, oh, you can eat it. And then you get a big surprise. And that happened to me. It was like an itinerant landscaper from Indiana who had found himself down here working for the county housing authority across the street from me. And he took me for a walk and he explained to me what that was and got me to pop one. But when you learn that this is like the Ur pepper of the Americas, right? That this is an intrinsically wild plant that cannot really be germinated from a seed unless it's been passed through the digestive system of a bird, right? Although there is some forager, Texas forager, who has a recipe on his blog for a way to replicate that process using battery acid. I have not yet chosen to try that myself, right? But and when you learn that basically this is like that somehow humans figured out a way to manipulate this plant to produce all the peppers of the North American table over the course of hundreds, probably thousands of years, it sort of changes how you see time and changes how you see the land and the life around you. So Chili Pekin is a plant you only find in empty lots. This is one that's kind of right by my house. Well, it's no longer empty now. This lot pictured here is now a 7-story apartment complex that occupies, well, under construction, that occupies kind of every last bit of square footage there. But there's a weird French theoretical term that came out in the 50s that I hate because it's one of those words that sounds like the kind of word that's designed to exclude anyone who doesn't already know what it means from being able to participate in the knowledge it imparts. The word is psychogeography. But I love what that word evokes, and it's an urbanist and urban theory word. And psychogeography is kind of a fancy, gold-plated way of trying to capture the idea of the places we go in our lives, and really like in our everyday lives, just our everyday movements through the city make us feel inside, right? The way that just, everyday life makes us feel. And the psychogeographers had this idea of trying to hack how you experience like everyday urban life by altering your routes every day, coming up with different ways of like, okay, instead of like walking the way the city wants me to go, the way it's always regulating my movements, even though it wants me to think I'm free, I'm going to make my own path, like draw a straight line or draw a circle or follow some kind of older route. And so what I'm talking about in the book is a kind of urban or an eco-psychogeography, a way of being in the city, but like learning to step off the pavement and try to see what kinds of manifestations of wild nature you can find without having to leave the city. And I talk in particular about moving to Austin in the late 90s as a young dad. I had a 3-year-old boy, and now I have his little sister. We're kind of doing the same thing, and going out to just like find interesting places to go to find little manifestations of real life in the city, and being blown away by how much really was there and the lessons about the resilience of nature that it afforded. Um, my exploration started as a kind of a search for spaces within walking distance from home or work that weren't paved over by capital, by human development, or manicured into the simulations of real life, that so many parks and even gardens tend to be, right? And many of these places that we started to find were places that had been developed for a period of time. They'd been, agricultural land uses at the edge of town, or industrial, like mineral extraction sites, things like that at the edge of town, or even, formerly industrial or commercial sites in the heart of town that for one reason or the other had kind of gone into disuse, and they had sort of temporarily been allowed to go back to wild. And in time, and so after doing that for a while, I started to become very interested in the charismatic wildlife you could find in these wild spaces that had evaded, the however momentary our dominion, these kinds of accidental or involuntary parklands, right, or accidental wilderness. There's a British nature writer, Richard Mabey, who did this beautiful book in 1973 called The Unofficial Countryside, where he just walked around the periphery of London and documented all the animal and plant life you could find there. And it's the same is true here. The animals, many of them predators, like this coyote behind my house, that have figured out how to live in the margins of our dominion, sort of evading our gazes, while somehow living on their own wild terms off the things the city provides. Even if the coyotes are not scavenging, they're hunting, but they're hunting the smaller mammals that are living off our trash, and foxes, possums, bobcats, armadillos, ringtails. I mean, that's the first time I found a ringtail out, in an old brown field on the other side of the river from me, hiding in a kind of a nook of a little outused building. It was like, as a Midwestern kid, it was like discovering some animal you didn't know existed. A new animal had just dropped. And in time, after, being sort of more interested in the charismatic wildlife, I started to learn to pay closer attention to the wild plants that could be found in these kinds of places, both native and non-native, and learning how to kind of tell first by intuition, in a way, what's native and non-native from how the plants sort of behave in the landscape, and learning the lessons that can be learned from, both the presence and the absence of wild plants, especially native plants, and lessons about how we and the other life around us interact. What urban nature, especially plant and insect life, teaches us about how broken our relationship as a collective is with the natural world, and how that alienation that we often have from the natural world is also the source of a lot of the alienation we have from each other and even from ourselves in our daily lives. And by the same measure, just the kind of getting back to the wonder, the hope that you can get even in the face of, really extreme daily climate doom scrolling, when you witness how resilient nature is in surviving in these just tiny margins that we leave for it. And so these experiences of just wandering around, in the interstices of my own life, right, in the space it afforded, on the weekends or early mornings with the dog or whatever, and then this experience that Bill talked about of trying to live in these kinds of spaces, it started to bleed into my own work as a novelist, and I was mostly writing dystopian novels, as Bill described, and I started to play around with this idea of reinventing nature writing, a genre, as I indicated, I'd always loved on like fresh and sort of more inclusive terms. My editor at Harper, who edited my science fiction novels called it dystopian nature writing, which wasn't a bad pin on it. And it's sort of a kind of nature writing that tries to tell the whole story of what's around us, inclusive of the human imprint on the landscape and seeing how it all works together. And, you know, over time, as I started to pay closer attention and learned that you can't just, you know, rely entirely on your own, like running around like some 21st century version of an 18th century naturalist, you have to start, you know, reading up on what's going on and understanding things like this fritillary I found, you know, one of many. I mean, these fritillaries seem to love to cocoon off, you know, machined metal that I think provides them some kind of weird, you know, incubational habitat advantage. I had a bunch of Gulf fritillaries one year when I had this old '87 Land Cruiser and I hadn't driven it a few months, and they all hatched on my hubcaps, which I thought was very exciting. But not to be, you know, a bummer on a Saturday morning, but in the last couple of years, as I've been doing this kind of work, I started paying closer attention to some of the reports that the World Wildlife Fund does about biodiversity trends on our planet and in, you know, the region where we live. And, you know, according to the October 2024 version of the World Wildlife Fund's Living Planet report, which you can look up, the vertebrate wildlife population of the planet has plummeted by an astonishing 73% since 1970. Right? And, you know, that's when I was like 6 years old, right? I mean, it's like in my lifetime. Bill and I were talking this morning about, you know, how we all sort of know there's a truth to those kinds of numbers when we hear them, even if, you know, those numbers may vary. It might be half that. If it's half that, it's still like a really scary number, right? You know, how you measure that is challenging. It's like, what species are you looking at, blah, blah, blah. But you think about, like, those of us who've been around since 1970, remember how it used to be if you drove your car for 2 hours on the highway, you know, you might have to pull over just to like clean the dead insects off your windshield to be able to go further. And that, I mean, I drive around Texas a lot. My wife drives even more for her work, and it just doesn't happen anymore. Or the Midwest where I grew up. If you look at these numbers, they give like hemispheric breakouts, and those tell a richer part of the story. According to the 2024 report, the hemispheric distribution was 39% loss in the U.S. and Canada, just insane. 96% in Latin America and the Caribbean. You know, and a lot of that has to do with really massive habitat loss, like in the Amazon, right? But there's also a story there of how, you know, a lot of this just happens through everyday sprawl, sort of, you know, one lot or subdivision at the time. On Thursday, Science, the natural history magazine, the Science Journal, published a brand new report about butterfly loss, which I know is important to all of y'all. And they estimate that the butterfly population of North America has dropped by 22% in the last 20 years. And it's declining at a rate of 1.3% a year. So, which is hopefully a predicate to talking about more hopeful stories, but just as a way to kind of like, you know, look what's going on, you know, with clear-headed eyes. And I find, as I'm always, you know, looking around for charismatic wildlife to liven up my morning, all manner of animals that have like adapted to extreme urban conditions. This season is the kind of nesting season of great blue herons. We live on kind of on the backside of the floodplain of the lower Colorado River, just below Longhorn Dam in Austin, where it's still kind of like the natural channel of the river, but still a heavily industrial corridor. And it's amazed me to see how many great blue heron rookeries we have, like tucked away in these. There's one that's got like 8 active nests right now. It's in this old sycamore, very tall, mature sycamore that's grown up on a little kind of channel island right at the edge of the river that's basically made of old landfill. Like you go down in there and you kind of kick around a little bit and you find like apothecary glass. And I found a, porcelain doll, from the, early 20th century. And this is down behind like an old warehouse, like, tilt up Morton building. Where until a couple of years ago, there was a muffler shop where you could also get your taxes done. And so I'm like, well, that's so weird, these herons, how bizarre, how special. And then I start reading and I'm like, herons have adapted to cities all over the continent. And, from Portland to Richmond and to Newark Bay, there are all these up in DFW, they have like in the zone between kind of around the airport, like between Dallas and Fort Worth, like Irving, Richardson, towns like that, where it's kind of like the river, the delta of the Trinity River. They get so many cattle egrets that the municipalities give out these handbooks before nesting season of how to scare them off before they nest. And even Texas Parks and Wildlife has a video you can find on YouTube of all these very effective techniques to terrify herons away so they won't defecate on your beautiful automobile. With like Mylar scare balloons and like those air horns I used to hear at the hockey games as a kid, and pruning back the trees so they can't form a canopy, but then hastening to point out to you that if you mess with them after there's an egg in the nest, it's a federal felony. So, and so I started thinking, and I was thinking like, oh, isn't this weird? And then I started like, oh, maybe these herons and egrets are making their homes and breeding in these intensely urban zones because that's kind of all they have left. Even though if you read the birding books, they'll tell you in the really natural conditions, a rookery can number as many as 500 active nests, at least with the blue crankies, as some of the settlers used to call the great blues, which if you've ever heard one in a bad mood, you'll understand why. Or the wildflowers that grow in the margins of all of our cities in Texas, thank goodness. Even in freshly bulldozed spots. Like this is right by my home. This is the like on-ramp and off-ramp of 183 that just got turned into a tollway over the past decade. So, I saw the earth movers out there. I saw them moving all this dirt, and then they go away, and, here it comes, this like memory in the land that somehow, I'm pretty sure they didn't drop a seed, and as Bill can tell you, or you all could probably tell me better than I know myself, the Blackland Prairie, that once, was the dominant ecosystem from like north of Dallas to the north end of San Antonio in a long, beautiful band. You can read Frederick Law Olmsted, the original American landscape gardener, the designer of Central Park. He did this saddle trip across Texas in the 1840s with his brother before he became the landscape professional. He was like a writer. He'd had to drop out of Harvard or Yale, and he was just making a living as a journalist. And he describes like coming up from Bastrop. They've kind of come up from Houston, and he describes this like beautiful prairie, like an ocean. And 99% of it's gone right now, something like that. But yet it's kind of, to some extent, still there, or a lot of that life is still there. And the possibility of its resuscitation is always manifest around us. Or like in this same spot, I'll see after a big rain and a dry season, the 2 or 3 days later, the rain lilies will pop up. And this another species that you're just like, where does it even come from? And it apparently knows the difference between real rain and like you can't water them into coming to existence. This laptop is giving me a low battery warning, FYI. And so when you witness how resilient wild nature is when we leave it a little space to do its own thing, like this is an abandoned lighting factory near my home. I suppose it's weird to think it's nice to live near an abandoned factory like this, but when you see, I think there's a beauty to this kind of urban weedy lot that actually has manifestations of the prairie in it. But when you see how resilient these species are, I think it's hard not to be optimistic about how rapidly it could recover. It could recover and restore biodiversity ecologies, even in the urban margins, if we made just a little effort to make it a priority. And for me, I have a low degree of confidence in our major institutions doing anything on this front, because I think they're deeply invested in the causes of biodiversity loss, which I'll talk about briefly in a minute. And I don't know that I really want like big institutions to tell us how to manage the land. I don't know that I trust them to do so. I think it's kind of up to all of us at the grassroots level in the management of our own land and of our lands we hold in common as communities to try to lead the way, because I think, as probably everybody here knows, once people experience as adults this connection to wild nature that I think a lot of people lose in the transition from childhood into adulthood, they're going to be as hooked as we are on maintaining it. So as Bill indicated, we did this in our own home. It's like a brownfield acre in East Austin that had the petroleum pipeline that diagonally bisected my site had been abandoned about 15 years before I found the property. There was when I went out to look at the lot, there was a big valve box right in the middle of the yard, like a steel hatch with a wheel like you'd find on a ship. And I was like, I wonder if I open, it's like the science fiction writer, maybe there's like, some secret underground community of mole men living under there or something. But no, there was not. And I was, I found myself a middle-aged bachelor at the time. So I was like, I could do this. I don't have to like convince my partner for life to do it. I did it on my own and with my as a half-time single dad. So set out to like work with Chevron to remove their environmental liability from my property, which they were happy to do if I was paying for it. And then found some crazy young architects, and I was like, I want to like articulate this idea of like living in urban nature, of like the house and the yard is sort of shared habitat, of a house that sort of supplicates itself to landscape and doesn't try to show off. It's sort of like trying to almost hide. And so so I found some young architects who kind of helped me come up with a way to articulate this as a design matter. I met my wife in the process, and she had a studio down the street, and then helped me with my now wife helped me with the project and helped me kind of explore these zones. And so we worked with the Wildflower Center. At the time, there was a gentleman named Mark Simmons who was a British ecologist who'd been like a military pilot, who then became a native plants person. Go figure. The trajectories people follow into this work always amaze me. And he found his way here. He sadly died of cancer about 15 years ago, but he and his proteges, people like Emily Manderson and John Hart Asher, back when the center still had their eco design group, they had come up with this growing medium that is like 8 inches of sort of weird mixes of kind of lightweight soil matters and rock matter and things like pecan shells and rice hull ash that sort of charge the foods to the nutrient sources. And we did this in 2012. We planted this green roof, and it's still, every season, I've never even hardly put any fertilizer on it. It's just kind of astonishing. I did an experiment, and I had grown up around, this is my mom. This is like who I tried to get to come down here today, but she didn't want to hear me jabber on for an hour. Maybe y'all can understand why now. But my parents had done like a classic Midwestern prairie restoration, where my dad was a dentist in Des Moines. It was like as normal a life as anyone could ever live. And my mom was a, stay-at-home mom. But she'd had this like connections to nature from childhood. And so they found during the farm crisis in the 80s, this like blighted piece of timber that was agriculturally bereft even in good times. And in agriculturally bad times, it was worth nothing. And so they bought it cheap. And my dad dragged me out there to try to start chainsawing and, hacksawing down all the junk trees and whatever. And then my mom was like, no, we just need to burn it. And at the time, like the county extension people were just like, that's crazy. That's like what Indians did or something. They're just like, that's crazy. And so they had to do it themselves. My dad singed both of his eyebrows off the first time. And they didn't cover that in dental school. It's like the PPD for that, or PP. And so, but without ever knowing that there was resources like Native American seed, they just burned it every year, controlled burns. In time, there were professional firefighter crews that, did it on the weekends. And they restored this oak savanna to what became recognized as one of the prime examples of this kind of an ecosystem in North America over like 25 years. And I was not that interested in it. And I was like, do I have to drive down there to like hillbilly country and come, there's nothing to do. There are no bookstores there. What am I going to do? And then I started going up in the summer. And then I was like, and it was just like that hokey movie Avatar, where there's like life buzzing around you everywhere. And you're like, oh, wait a minute. This is kind of nice. I can just sit here on the back porch for a while and just like watch the hummingbirds and the butterflies and soak it up. And you got a sense of what that kind of restoration of biodiversity, one, how easy. It was like some suburban couple from Des Moines just like torching their yard every year for a few years, right? And you do it over a few seasons and generations, and it's sort of astonishing what you can accomplish. Doing this in the city is a little trickier. I mean, I will admit against interest, as we say in the lawyer business, that I have been out with my dad is like, oh, you got to get one of these Red Dragon propane torches. They're really fun to use. So get every honest all-American yard boy when they grow up wants to have a backpack-powered flamethrower to take to the yard, right? And so I would have like a hose in one hand and my torch in the other hand, and I'd look over at the door factory with the giant gas tanks, and like, yeah, this is a bad idea. So we just mostly, and I would go to Home Depot and buy big sheets of black plastic. And so that whole front yard that was just like, Bermuda grass and Johnson grass when we bought the land. Well, a mix. It wasn't all that bad, but this part of Austin, what you find is where there's canopy, native grasses tend to thrive, especially like inland sea oats. And then where there's direct sun, the invasives take over. So, but you solarize that, and they come up, they find no life, and then you seed it and water it if it's we're not in a drought, and you get this. They kind of get back to, how over the seasons of doing this, you get a sense of, you start thinking about, I don't know, if you're a weirdo like me, at least, you're like, well, why is it so hard to kind of bring back healthy ecologies when you just see how good it makes you feel? Even with just like independently of the what they now call ecosystem services, the development economists, where there's bona fide economic benefits to human society of healthy ecologies. And what I came to realize over time, looking at it through the prism of as a lawyer who thinks a lot about, kind of property and the systems whereby we, the legal systems that encode how we manage nature, as somebody who works in the economics field, and as a, speculative fiction writer, that a lot of the story is embedded in this photo right here, where you have, this is, a little bit of Indian paintbrush or whatever with its beautiful fiery bracts growing up in a freshly, recently mowed and bulldozed, median across from a dairy plant that's now abandoned, but at the time was, on one side of a wildlife sanctuary, if you can believe that. Things like dairy plants and farm fields, like where I grew up in Iowa, where the experience you have growing up looking for nature in the Corn Belt is you go out into the country. You're taught, like, if you want to see nature, go out away from the city to the country. You do that in the Midwest, and it's just like everything is green, but nothing is really alive, and you can just tell. And where the life was always is like, in the floodplain of the river, kind of flowing through the back parts of town. But human civilization is built on the control of the reproduction of other life, right? Animals first, and pastoral culture, and then plants, and ultimately other people, through various systems of making people do the work to produce more surplus from agriculture or from the urban kind of derivatives of it. And at the core is, the Neolithic revolution that we were all taught about in school of, the discovery of grain agriculture. In 2017, the late political scientist James Scott wrote a beautiful book called Against the Grain, which is a kind of reconsideration of that seminal moment in the development of human civilization. And he talks about how he takes all the most recent archaeological and anthropological evidence to talk about kind of what really went on in that moment, in the sort of fertile crescent of 7th grade social studies or whatever, right? And what he found is that what the research is starting to show is that there were the classic kind of nomadic or kind of wandering bands of hunter-forager societies. People would typically live in groups of 50 to 150 with no real leadership structures because they were small enough, and they would go to where the food sources were, and then they would move on with the seasons. And at one point, about 12,000 years ago, some of these groups started to find these really biodiverse wetlands in what's now southeastern Iraq, where it was oh, we can just stay here all year round, and there's abundant food sources, with different seasons. And so they settled in, and in time they figured out how they could control the reproduction of the grain plants that were growing there. And that discovery of how we can control and domesticate and kind of engineer through our own ingenuity grains is kind of it's just the core of, where we're at now, of all of this abundance and security we built around us. So the stuff that allows us to live as long as we do, that, to keep this, store of food around that'll feed your children, in a lean season, right? And then the accumulation of that surplus, and that's why the grains were especially valuable, because, cereals, because they are like proto money, right? Once you realize it has this value when you store it, it evolves into money. So very quickly then, these social systems developed the first cities, of Ur and all these cities we read about again in grade school social studies, around the control of the surplus. And from that comes the need to get other people to do the work to make more, right? Scott talks about how what they find in these early cities is that they mostly got by enslaving their neighbors to come work the fields, right? And that to be a so-called barbarian was the only way to truly be free. And so obviously that's it's the killer app of human civilization that's also flawed in a way, and reckoning with that I think is important to figuring out ways to really solve our kind of current crisis. And pastoral culture similarly. The Canadian scholar Alan Greer has done an amazing series of recent studies about how the commons was really integral to early colonial culture in this country, but the introduction of pastoral culture into the kind of peripheries of the early colonial settlements were what essentially dispossessed the Native Americans, because they had a kind of shared commons, but then as soon as pastoral culture came in, it was so immediately ecologically destructive that it forced these populations of indigenous folks to move on. So I'm going to quickly tilt into sci-fi territory, just to try to keep us awake, and we're almost to the end here. And I talk about how it struck me as I was, exploring all these territories, how the dream of rewilding the future, of bringing back, more kind of real biodiverse life, it's all over our popular culture if you kind of start looking for it, sort of hiding in plain sight. This is an image of a movie I really enjoyed as a kid, really cheesy movie that was one of Farrah Fawcett, our Dallas doyen's first movie. It's called Logan's Run, which was shot inside a Dallas Fort Worth area mall to represent the future, like a 23rd century future. And this is kind of, this even looks like kind of like Las Colinas to me, you know, monorail and all. And inside this domed city was depicted a post-collapse utopia of worker consumers chasing an illusion of eternal youth in a world of mirrors and shopping. All their lives are managed by a central computer, a kind of artificial intelligence that they've just like inherited. They meet domestic partners through a TV-based app where they like swipe through until they find somebody they're attracted to. Imagine, that could never happen. And in the story, the central character played by Michael York, who's like that, you know, one of those central kind of classic faces from 70s television. He plays a policeman who's in charge of regulating and maintaining the structure. And through the TV, he meets this girl played by Jenny Agutter, who's a rebel who's trying to get out of the city and who's heard that if you get out of the dome, you know, that's where sanctuary is. So she persuades him to come along and break the rules. And when they finally get outside after their long, you know, Campbellian hero's journey, they find their way out through underground tunnels, through a, you know, world of ice. They fight robots and monsters, and then they find what the computers that run their society have told them is an uninhabitable zone. They find a rewilded Washington, D.C. And eventually they find an actual old human played by Peter Ustinov, if any of you remember that guy. He's like hanging out in the Senate chamber with a bunch of cats and books and cats and plants. And I'm like, I could do that. I think that's kind of what I was trying to do when I built my house in the brownfield, but instead I fell in love and started a new family. And they visit the Lincoln Memorial, which looks like a Mayan ruin overtaken by swamp. You know, and similar variants of this kind of story, sort of slightly cheesy, they're all over when you look for them, stories that are presented as warnings about what will happen to our beautiful civilization if we don't, you know, mind our P's and Q's. But I think the reason they work to make us keep going back to the story is because they fill us with wonder, because they're also expressing kind of latently an unexpressed yearning we have for a restoration of balance between us and nature. And it might seem like an inherently fantastical vision. You might think, until you learn like what the land was like around the Lincoln Memorial a mere century ago. This is a picture from 1917, right? Library of Congress, the only photo I didn't take in here. You know, the idea of, you know, draining the swamp has an older meaning than contemporary usage reveals. And I don't mean it in contemporary political part. I grew up in Iowa, where like, get rid of that water, it's messing with my corn, right? But this is, you know, Foggy Bottom now, where the State Department is, right? And, you know, a bunch of condo towers. You know, and as the wetland restoration projects and prairie restoration projects the federal government has subsidized on agricultural land since the 1980s show, you know, the ability of the land to restore itself when removed from use for the generation of human surplus is remarkable. And if you apply a little good stewardship, as our sacred books teach us is kind of our duty, as the, you know, the inheritors of a sort of planetary dominion, the potential is profound. So this kind of oddball way of looking at the world may be why, when in the summer of 2009, I stumbled upon this abandoned car. It's a mid-60s Chevy Impala, I'm pretty sure. You know, one of those like, with that kind of like sort of Batmobile meets JFK kind of energy. Half submerged in a wetland hidden behind that dairy plant I showed you a few slides ago. Walking distance from the home site I had just bought with borrowed money, right? You know, and finding a wrecked car near your new home site is probably not what the typical homeowner is excited about. But for me, when I saw this, I was sort of elated rather than alarmed. I'd spent a decade by that point exploring these kinds of urban edgelands, as the English like to call them. And I had decided to make my home in one. And this kind of certified it. It was like a real world scene that looked like an image from one of those end of the world movies, right? It helped me see that what looks like the end is also a beginning, right? And especially when, after my romantic idea that, oh, I've discovered a precious intact remnant of what the Colorado River corridor was like before, Anglo-American settlement. Look at me, aren't I clever? And then you're like, oh no, like when you were watching Logan's Run in Des Moines, kid, this was a gravel pit, right? 40 years ago or whatever. And then it was just like, they told the gravel mines they had to go to, a little further east out of town. And this is just what the river and the woods at the edge of the river did with nobody paying any attention. This really incredible biodiverse wetland. The term rewilding is kind of a popular term now. It has complicated origins, including an association, especially in Europe, with what some people call eco-fascist movements. People who are like, have this kind of, to me, crazy idea that the way to get to a healthier future is through some kind of like program of compulsory depopulation, or trying to like really manage the human population. And we see this coming up all over in the margins of our current political debates. I'm interested in like a more humanist idea of rewilding, as I imagine a lot of you are. The idea that we can embrace our capacity for healthy coexistence with wild nature, and are charged to be good stewards to cultivate biodiversity alongside human flourishing, that doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. And really that's the key to human and collective flourishing. And you can see this potential, I think, all over the place, even in mostly blighted spots like this, view of Shoal Creek in downtown office near my law office. Smarter, bigger cities than ours have been doing some really amazing projects like this. From Munich, Germany, where they've restored the Isar River, which was kind of like an industrial canal. They restored 6 miles of river. They figured out how to control the water that's coming in from the urban creeks. They tore up the concrete banks and kind of put back in like natural shoals. And you go there in the summer. I've been there visiting relatives and going to family reunions of my mom, and like people running out of their office in the middle of the day and like taking off their suits and jumping in the water to go for a swim or have a picnic or whatever. You see the immediate impact. In Seoul, where my adult son lived for a while in Korea, they have a creek called Cheonggaicheon, which was like a creek that was covered with an overpass for like 75 years. And they're like, well, why don't we bury the road and daylight the creek and then like restore it? And it's kind of the same kind of effect. Even places like the High Line in New York, which maybe some of you have seen, it's not really wild, but it shows some of that yearning. And people are getting more serious about it. In the United Kingdom, they just, under the conservative government, prior to last year's elections, they promulgated final rules to require that any new real estate development of any significant size has to show, after completion, a 10% net gain in biodiversity, right? And it's like, if you just start having simple programs like that, and I think, now some of it, gets gamed. You can like, I'll buy it for those other, for this other site over here, and I'm going to do my site the way I want it, or whatever. And, but it's, it's exciting. And there's all these talks about, kind of biodiversity credit programs and whatnot, but people are starting to take it more seriously. In the US, it's harder to imagine like something like that, a rule like that being implemented in our, growth focused and kind of developer driven, economic growth driven culture, which, are attending to other important things that sustain our lives, but we can each do it ourselves, right? And just taking that idea of, I'm gonna, leave more biodiversity than I found when I got here, just applying that kind of almost like golden rule of our relationship with nature. I think that's the way we achieve it, and starting to just, turn our neighbors on to it and teaching people that, you know, a wild yard is the most beautiful kind of yard. And as the reformed lawn boy will tell you, it's a lot less work. Now, a rewilded future won't look like the past. The mix of species may be different, but in balance, or hopefully in balance. I've learned a lot of lessons from this old mesquite tree in my yard, which is, I have an old 70s Airstream that has been until very recently in my home office. I finally gave up on trying to like make the air conditioner work in August afternoons, but and sitting in that trailer, you know, which is just like a little aluminum can, I'd be out there working in the summer and late summer, and then, you know, I'd suddenly hear like things falling on the roof, and I'd go out and here's this gnarled old mesquite tree. It's like the oldest tree in our yard. It's only probably 70 years old, according to this master arborist who came around. It's really beautiful in the way it's kind of bent, and, you know, the way mesquites can kind of tell, or like the same way that big oaks do, they kind of tell some of the story of the abuse they've suffered from nature and from us, right? You know, and they're kind of gnarly trees. They're trees that are a sign of disturbance in the first place. And the only animals that come around to eat the food that they generate are these crazy monk parakeets, which, as I note in the opening of my book, are, like my wife, immigrants from Argentina. And they, you know, the story of the monk parakeets is that they were being imported illegally for the exotic pet trade, and there was a crate of them that broke open on the tarmac of JFK Airport in Queens in 1967, and they just were like, oh, I kind of like it here, and proceeded to colonize their way all the way down to here. And they love the seed pods and the mesquites. And then in time, you learn like, oh, the mesquites are co-evolved to have their seed pods eaten by animals that disappeared coincidentally. Causation cannot be proved with the arrival of humans onto the North American continent, right? The mastodons and mammoths and glyptodonts and, you know, like armadillos the size of Volkswagens and giant sloths. It would be pretty cool to see one of those. That would be keeping Austin weird. And so, you know, when you see this kind of adaptation that sort of brings back a kind of a funny balance, that, you know, maybe if you would really like to achieve like a perfect restoration, this is not, you know, your ideal outcome. But to me, as looking at the changing climate too, I mean, these kinds of adaptations are going to be part of the story in the same way. So that, you know, same with like the bodark tree in my yard, which it took me like these fruit just fall and they're like softballs, and they're like, oh, I get it now. It's like a mastodon Cheeto, right? You know, and so trying to think about how we're all going to adapt, including the other life around us, is I don't know, that's the thing we're charged with, right? Is how do we, you know, kind of see what we've got here? I mean, the destruction that we have done to the landscape cannot ever fully be remedied. Whatever comes is going to be new. It's like the ghost wolves of Galveston. Have any of you read about the ghost wolves of Galveston, where you know, the red wolf, canine predator that was, you know, native to Texas, thought to be extinct in the wild since the 50s. The only wild members of that species thought to still be around are a group of about 20 that were reintroduced in North Carolina in the mountains, which is another part of their kind of native habitat. And recently, in the past few years, this amateur naturalist living in an apartment block in Galveston, kind of on the north end of the island, started seeing all these coyotes, and he says, don't look like normal coyotes. What's up with that? And he would go around and collect like coyote roadkill and other genetic material, and like phone-a-thon to like biologists at universities, like, can I send you some, you know, dead roadkill coyote from Galveston for you to test? And they're like, hell no. And but finally he got somebody, like people in Indiana, and lo and behold, these coyotes were like 30 to 40% red wolf. They had like interbred to adapt to living off the, you know, hunting the animals that are out there at the edges of Margaritaville eating our trash. So to me, those are beautiful stories. So I'll stop there. Thank you for indulging me. I don't know if y'all have questions. I should have encouraged you to ask questions along the way. This is my wife and daughter here, and this is at Circle Acres, which is a preserve in East Austin, kind of behind Guerrero Park, in an old landfill where there's so much methane in the ground that they won't let us do controlled burns because they're afraid we'll like blow up Montopolis. I'm on the board of Ecology Action, which is the oldest environmental nonprofit in the state. Used to do the recycling center on the frontage road, if you all are familiar with it. And now we just manage this acreage, which in fact, Bill's daughter Emily helped do the original restoration work for. So happy to enter. Yeah, question.
So she lives in a brownfield and raising a family. How did you get assurance that you removed all the toxins to move your family into the space?
I mean, yeah. So the question is, brownfield rewilding and phytoremediation sounds good on a slideshow. Like, how do you get confident enough that you have a reason to believe it's safe to go like live there with your family? It helped that at the time I did this, I was a half-time single dad, and my son was in middle school, and I was like, oh, well, you know, I'm the only one who will be harmed, and he was in on the game. And but you do basic environmental testing, and I mean, there are established methods of doing it, you know. And I remember when this pipeline removal crew came out, you know, we were renting a little cottage next door, and we woke up on like a Tuesday morning and look out, and there's like a bunch of people in blue hazmat suits in our front yard. You know, it's a surreal thing to see. But you know, I remember talking to the lawyer who helped me negotiate, the lawyer for the, and they're like, those businesses, they are like all about safety and about doing everything they can to test it and make sure. So I had a phase 1 and a phase 2 done before I even bought the property. And then when they came out to remove the pipe, they, you know, did all the same work. And I think, so, you know, you can do normal due diligence. And I also think, you know, a lot of places that sort of appear clean on the surface to us or are presented to us as such are not that much cleaner. And when my daughter was born in 2019, it sort of took a fresh perspective on this place. It's like, oh, is this really safe to like raise an infant? We satisfied ourselves it was, and that, you know, the bigger concern is not like the toxins in the ground, if there are any, but the like coral snakes sneaking up to the back door. But even they will probably leave her alone. So.
Do you have other questions? Catch Christopher at the break.
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you, sir.
very much.
All right. Thank you.